Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 6, 2015, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Veasey, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the Minority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the life and legacy of one of the great leaders that stood tall here in Washington, D.C. and back home in Texas, James Jim Claude Wright, Jr., who passed away recently back in May at the age of 92. And sadly, Mr. Speaker, I'm sad to announce that his wife, Betty, just died on July 15th, just last week. And so the family has been through a lot. And we have a lot of really nice stories to tell about Speaker Wright and how he has influenced so many people. And I want to begin by recognizing our minority whip from Maryland, the gentleman, Steny Hoyer.
I thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding. Jim Wright would have been proud of Marc Veasey. He would have said Marc Veasey is in the Jim Wright tradition. I'm going to speak a little bit about that. Mr. Speaker, I rise to talk about a Mr. Speaker, to pay tribute to the life and legacy of a man who served this House and our country with distinction as a member, as Majority Leader, and as Speaker. Jim Wright was a man of principle and great political skill, and he relied on both during his 34 years in Congress. I have now served 34 years in Congress. And part of that 34 years, I had the honor of serving with Jim Wright. Just 2 years after he was first elected to represent Texas's 12th Congressional District, Jim stuck to his principles and refused to sign the Southern Manifesto opposing desegregation, as so many of his Southern colleagues did. It was a risk, of course, Mr. Speaker, politically, but he put his belief in equal opportunity ahead of what was politically popular among his constituents at the time. And when he voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1957, it was a further sign of his courage, of his conviction, and of his adherence to the principles that have made our country so great and so respected. In spite of breaking with many of his Southern conservative Democratic colleagues on that issue, he forged friendships with them based on mutual respect and good old-fashioned camaraderie, just as he did with members from other parts of the country and across party lines. Jim was elected Majority Leader in 1976, and he was serving in that capacity when I came to Congress in 1981. Today, Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to sit in the same office, H-148, in the Capitol building, just a few feet from this floor, where Jim Wright sat as the Majority Leader. If you look up towards the ceiling in one corner of our office suite, you can still see the great seal of the state of Texas painted on the wall. Emblazoned in the center of that seal is the proud Lone Star of Texas. Sam Rayburn may have been one of those stars. Lyndon Johnson may have been one of those stars. And many other Texans may have been one of those stars. But in our office, that Lone Star stands for Speaker Jim Wright. In many ways, Jim was that Lone Star who stood out at the center of our party in this House, a leader who knew how to bring members together by inspiring them to follow his example. And he never wavered in his mission to bring Democrats and Republicans together and replace partisan divisions with cooperation, comity, and, yes, compromise, which is in such little supply on this floor right now. Jim was an extraordinary person. He was someone who refused to take no for an answer and seemed destined to serve his community and his country. Mr. Speaker, at age 10, he tried hard to join the Boy Scouts, even though he was 2 years shy of the minimum age to participate. And at 13, Jim lied and said he was 16 in order to enter a boxing tournament. Now, there's some 13-year-olds who can empathize with that. And, Mr. Speaker, he already almost won that competition. In high school, his classmates wrote in his class of 1939 yearbook that Jim would likely be serving in Congress by 1955. How prescient his classmates were, for he won his first congressional election in 1954. While in college at the University of Texas, Jim learned that the attack on Pearl Harbor had occurred. Without hesitation, he decided to drop out the next day and join the Army Air Corps. Jim flew more than 300 combat hours over the South Pacific. He flew, as my stepfather did, in the battles that were fought in the Pacific to combat those who had attacked Pearl Harbor. He was decorated for his distinguished service. Those of us who served with Jim in the House saw the same determined spirit he demonstrated in the Army as he applied himself to serving the people of Texas's 12th District. I had the opportunity to be at Jim Wright's funeral on May 11th of this year. You know, on the day of his assassination and the last speech of his life, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy visited what he called Jim Wright's city and praised the congressman by saying, quote, "I don't know of any city that is better represented in the Congress of the United States than Fort Worth, Texas." I can remember the year after Jim Wright was elected Speaker of the House, I had the opportunity of chairing and emceeing a dinner that was held in Fort Worth, one of the biggest ever held there. I will echo, therefore, that sentiment. I can think of few who served in the Congress who will be remembered as fondly by those they served with than Jim Wright, by his constituents, by his colleagues, and by his family. He loved this institution dearly. His family and those who serve with him, like me, will miss him. A grateful nation thanks him for a lifetime of service to us all. And I thank the gentleman for yielding me the time.
Mr. Hoyer, thank you very much. I appreciate those very kind words about Speaker Wright, and everyone in Fort Worth and the Metroplex will appreciate those kind words as well. And now I also would like to recognize Leader Nancy Pelosi, another member of Congress who also served with Speaker Wright, and someone that she was also very fond of and had the opportunity to talk with Speaker Wright a couple of years before his passing when she was down in Fort Worth. And so, Mr. Speaker, I now recognize Leader Nancy Pelosi.
I thank the gentleman for yielding time on this very special order. And I thank you for affording me the opportunity to visit with Speaker Wright, as you mentioned, in just the recent past. On a number of occasions on visits to Texas, I've had the privilege of basking in his glow, because that's what we did here in the Congress of the United States. When Jim Wright was the Speaker of the House, I had the privilege to serve under his leadership for a short period of time because I was relatively new. I was a new member at the time. And when he would come to this floor, to this well, to speak as the Speaker of the House, his oratory was just so compelling. People would stop what they were doing to listen to what Jim Wright had to say. and how he had to say it. In some ways, that was of another era that harkened back to how the work of Congress was conducted, where people would come and actually listen to the debate. He was a man of great oratorical skill, of course, a legislative master, but he was also a person of great courage and a person of great principle. Tonight we gather on the floor to honor the memory of this great Speaker of the House. From the service that earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross in World War II to the leadership that defined his 34 years in the House, Jim Wright exemplified commitment to the future of America's families, a bright future. He was a great patriot. He was one of America's most distinguished and dedicated public servants, a person known for deep courage, brilliant eloquence, and complete mastery of the legislative process. Wright's strong, decisive leadership built an indelible legacy of progress not only in his beloved state of Texas, but around the world. Jim Wright championed investing in our infrastructure. He had been a member of the Transportation Committee. He helped forge a path to peace in Central America, and for that, I will always be grateful to him for his brilliance, for his leadership, but especially for his courage. It was hard to do. Jim Wright sought prosperity for every hardworking family. Speaker Wright was a patriot who held the respect of friends and colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Even after he left the House, Wright continued to contribute to building a better future for our country, sharing his wisdom with a new generation of leaders as professor at Texas Christian University. When Jim Wright was presented the gavel in 1987, becoming the Speaker of the 100th Congress, he spoke of the enduring promise of our Constitution and of the sacred responsibility it entrusts the members of the House. He said, "We are its custodians." Those men of principle and vision who penned the deed to freedom had in mind a very special place for the Congress. Ours, he said, is a creative and dynamic role. We alone can legislate, only we can appropriate. We are expected to initiate, to innovate, to see the obstacles on the road ahead, and to chart a path around them for our nation. He went on to say, "Let us, with gratitude for the privilege that is ours, ask Almighty God that He shall grant to each of us a portion of the vision to see the right, the courage to stand for the right, the honesty to admit human error, and the love that binds our nation and our people together, to the end that we may continue to be not only the envy of the world, but an inspiration to the world and an instrument of His peace." 28 years later, Jim Wright's prayer for bravery and humility still speaks to us through the decades. He was indeed a person who had the vision to see the right, the courage to stand for the right, and for that we are enormously grateful. Speaker Jim Wright never stopped serving our country, and his achievements will stand forever as a living monument to his determined vision and legislative ability. I learned a lot from Jim Wright in the short period of time that I served with him in Congress, and from time to time I share those lessons with newer members of Congress. I do so with great, I learned a lot, as I said, but also with great humor. We hope it is a comfort to Speaker Wright's family, friends, and students and colleagues that so many of us share their grief, and some come to the floor to join with them in celebrating his memory. May his legacy long keep watch over the House he led, and may it challenge all of us to do more and do better on behalf of America's hardworking families. Thank you to Jim Wright's family for sharing him with all of us. It was an honor to serve with him. It was even a bigger privilege to call him friend. I miss that we will not be seeing him from time to time in Texas. I always invited him to the Congress for any special occasion we had, and on one or two occasions he did accept, and that was an honor for this House. With that, I yield back to the gentleman and thank him for yielding and for calling this special order. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader Pelosi. I appreciate those kind words about Speaker Wright, and I know that his family will appreciate everything that you had to share. Thank you so much.
Gentleman yield again.
Absolutely. Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentlelady from
I
California.
do want to add to my remarks because I was so taken by speaking about Jim Wright, but on the occasions I did see him in Texas, on most recent occasions, how he expressed the pride he took in your service in the Congress. So congratulations to you for carrying on that beautiful legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Leader. And now I would like to recognize from the 30th Congressional District in Texas, the gentlewoman from Dallas, Eddie Bernice Johnson, who also was very well acquainted and was a good friend of Speaker Wright's, and has some great stories about things that she shared with Speaker Wright over the years. And so now I'd like to welcome the gentlewoman from the 30th District from Dallas, Texas, Eddie Bernice Johnson.
Thank you very much, Congressman Veasey. Mr. Speaker, I rise today with great pleasure to pay tribute to the life and legacy of the former Speaker of the House, James Jim Wright, who passed away on Wednesday, May the 6th, at age 92 of this year. Speaker Wright served in Congress for more than 3 decades and left an indelible legacy as chairman of the Public Works Committee that is now named the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. He was elected by his peers as Speaker in 1987. He was born in Fort Worth, Texas, the son of a traveling salesman. He was educated at Weatherford College and the University of Texas at Austin. He dedicated his life to serving in public service. He bravely served in the United States Army Air Force during World War II and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for flying combat missions in South Pacific. Subsequently, he was elected to the Texas House of Representatives in 1946. He served as mayor of Weatherford, Texas from 1950 to 1954 and was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1954 and was re-elected 16 times. Speaker Wright was a visionary who served the people of Fort Worth and this nation well. He is deserving of this tribute. Because of his leadership, the House experienced one of the most prolific periods. Speaker Wright demonstrated his skill as a political leader and a master legislator by shepherding extraordinary complex legislation through the House. He understood that the business of legislating and good politics required good skill in the art of compromise. Speaker Wright never backed down from a challenge, and even after leaving office, he continued to serve the public diligently. I was always able to consult with Speaker Wright, and I'll always cherish those memories. He helped me get through the period of doing away with the Wright Amendment. He was the author of the Wright Amendment at the time the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport was built. And when it came time for it to change, only Speaker Wright, even in retirement, was able to get it loose in the Senate so that we could get it passed in the House as well. So our country has lost one of the finest statesmen, and I have lost a very close personal friend whose wisdom, dignity, and knowledge of the legislative process was unquestionably enviable. He is among the most influential speakers in the history of the House of Representatives. Jim Wright is really an unforgettable public servant and leader, a man fueled by passion and concern for others. He set the bar high for his successors. And at the time of his death, he was survived by his wife, Betty, who was deceased just recently, and 4 children. I stand today to honor former Speaker of the House, Jim Wright, and thank him for his work in the service of the people of Texas and throughout the nation. He has left a powerful legacy, and we will live it on through generations. I want to thank my colleague, Congressman Veasey, for having the leadership and the vision for waiting for a while to be able to sponsor this hour in tribute to Speaker Wright. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman from the 30th District, Eddie Bernice Johnson, for your very kind words about Speaker Wright. He was very fond of you and appreciated your leadership in an area that he excelled in, which was transportation. And just want to thank you for your kind words. And now I would like to recognize from Houston, Texas, the distinguished gentlelady, Sheila Jackson Lee, who would also like to have a few words about Speaker Jim Wright. So many Texans that served with Jim Wright and didn't have the opportunity to serve with him really appreciated his style, everything that he stood for. He was such a statesman, and you can tell how his influence was felt because so many individuals like Sheila, so many other people that knew the speaker, reached out to me after his death and wanted to send condolences to friends and family, and just thankful that he was so influential in Sheila Jackson Lee's life as well. And so now, Mr. Speaker, the gentlelady from Houston, Sheila Jackson Lee.
Let me thank the gentleman from Texas and in particular Fort Worth, and I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues from all over the nation, Leader Pelosi and Whip Hoyer, and my colleague as well, Congresswoman Johnson from Dallas. We all gathered at the funeral of Speaker Wright, and it was almost like a reunion of family members from the many political persons, public servants who not only through the years had known Speaker Wright, but really those who came to honor him because of the iconic role that he played in the history of Texas and the history of America. We're excited that he was a speaker that cared about people and cared about members. He, as was indicated, was born in Fort Worth, loved Fort Worth, and never wanted to leave Fort Worth. I think it's interesting that he was the son of a professional boxer who turned tailor, but as well that after the attack in Pearl Harbor, December 1941, he left college to enlist in the United States Army and flew combat missions in South Pacific, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Legion of Merit. He was of the greatest generation. He served in the Texas House, and from his hometown of Weatherford, he became a mayor, or was a mayor, his boyhood home, and he served in that post for 4 years from 1950 to 1954 before his first congressional victory. And as well, Speaker Wright had a way with words. He was an eloquent speaker. He was a disciple of House Speaker Sam Rayburn, a fellow Texan. He was also a confidant of another Texan, Lyndon B. Johnson, who served in the Senate during Wright's initial years in Congress before becoming vice president in 1961. And as well, he was in the presidential motorcade on November 22nd, 1963, when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. To describe the depth of sadness that engulfed us that day defies vocabulary, he once said, recalling how the friendly mood of the Dallas crowds turned to sheer terror and horror. It was that day that his friend, President Johnson, became the President of the United States. He worked hard for the people of Fort Worth. He was a person of deep courage, brilliance, eloquence, and complete mastery of the legislative process. He was decisive and strong, and he handled his Texas members. He championed the causes of Texas. He believed in the goodness of America, and he was a great achiever. Loved the Boy Scouts, and as I indicated, his father was a boxer. He started out doing that as well. And so I come today to honor him as a great American and to add to this tribute that he served with President Lyndon Baines Johnson when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed. He was a friend of my predecessor, one of my predecessors, the Honorable Barbara Jordan. They served together. They knew each other. They were strong Texans, but they loved America. And so I know that as we look to promoting his legacy, besides caring about this institution and loving America and honoring our men and women in the United States military, I know that it is also time in his name to bring forward the Voting Rights Act reauthorization that will again restore and invest in the rights of people to vote and will capture what he understood to be the right way to handle America's business. And as well, it captures his friend's vision, the Honorable Barbara Jordan, who in fact wrote the language to add Texas to the Voting Rights Act. So I thank you, Congressman, for having this very special order for us to thank a dear friend who, again, I salute tonight as a great American. To his family, thank you so very much for sharing Jim Wright, Speaker Wright, great Texan and great American, with all of us. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank the gentlelady from Houston, Sheila Jackson Lee, for sharing so many great stories and fond memories of Speaker Jim Wright. And I would like to add a few words of my own. And Jim Wright was very influential to me. When I was elected into the state legislature in 2004, was when I really started to get to know him well. I had known him previous to that when I was a aide for United States Congressman Martin Frost, who was also from Fort Worth. But once I got into the state legislature, I got to know him even more, and I realized very quickly what a great storyteller he was. Speaker Wright had some amazing stories from people that he had met over the years, people that influenced him in his life. And so many people always wonder how he became the great orator that he was. There were so many stories that I heard early on about before the House had C-SPAN. Now we can watch coverage of the House of Representatives 24 hours a day thanks to technology. But Speaker Wright was such a great speaker, great orator, that before C-SPAN came into effect, you heard stories about staffers coming to fill the galleries so they could come and hear this man from Fort Worth, Texas, come in and give speeches because they were so amazing. And I asked him, I said, how did you become the great orator that you were when you were in the U.S. House of Representatives and that you still are today, even with, unfortunately, with the oral cancer that he had and his speech had been hampered, but it was still amazing, the wisdom and the knowledge that he shared. And as you've heard from so many speakers tonight, boxing was a very important part of his life. He loved boxing. It was something that he watched over the years. And when he was growing up in Weatherford, Texas, that was one of the ways how young boys and men distinguished themselves, was their boxing skills on the street. And he told me that one day his dad told him that while it was great that he was able to distinguish himself with his fist through boxing, that if he really wanted to improve himself and improve his lot in life, that he would learn how to be a great orator, that he would learn what the anatomy of a great speech was all about. And so Jim Wright, at a very early age, decided that he was going to learn how he could become a better speaker. And there are so many stories like that. I went to his office right before I was sworn in 2012, and I asked him to just share some of that wisdom with me as an incoming new member of Congress. And he told me so many stories that day. One of them related to boxing. I had told him that Larry Hagman, many of you know Larry Hagman from I Dream of Jeannie and from the TV series Dallas. And some of you may know that Larry Hagman's mother, Mary Martin of Peter Pan fame, Mary Martin was actually from Weatherford, Texas. And she knew Jim Wright and knew Speaker Wright's family. And I said, Larry Hagman told a friend of mine that he ran into that you taught him how to box. And I said, is that true? And Speaker Wright began to tell me the story about how his mother thought that maybe he needed to get back to his Texas roots and have a little bit more Texas upbringing in him. And so she sent him back to Weatherford, Texas with his dad, and Speaker Wright taught him how to box. And that was how Larry Hagman learned how to become a boxer. One of the areas that Speaker Wright and Nancy Pelosi talked about it a lot, how he was a big influence in my life and so many others. And I would be remiss if I did not mention some of the former members that also he was very influential in their lives. Congressman Martin Frost, who was the ranking member of the Rules Committee. Speaker Wright was very influential in getting him on the Rules Committee his freshman year in office. And also Secretary Pete Guerin, a former member of Congress and Secretary of the Army and Air Force. And again, Speaker Wright, very influential early on in his career. Pete Guerin was actually Speaker Wright's successor in Congress. And that was also very important to him. And many people know that Speaker Wright was known as a very strong Democrat. He was someone that loved the Democratic Party, that was very proud of his Democratic roots, had a very strong relationship with organized labor in Tarrant County. And when you talk to people that are longtime employees at Lockheed Martin, at General Motors, at American Airlines, the things that he did with transportation, all of those things, were very, very important person for who he became. And in addition to that, he also learned a lot from some of the failures and mistakes that he made. He told me that his first term in the state legislature, that it was not easy, that he didn't get along with the Speaker of the House in the state legislature. And so when he was elected here, he wanted to make sure that he got along with Sam Rayburn when he was elected to Congress. And he told me, he said, Mark, I learned my lesson from when I was in the state legislature, and I really wanted to be on the Foreign Affairs Committee because that was what was really happening back in the 1950s when I first got elected. And with the Cold War going on, I wanted to be on that committee. It was something very important to me. And Speaker Rayburn put me on the Public Works Committee, which is now the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And he said, that was a mistake that I made. And because that committee ended up really making my career, it's hard to think that I would have become Majority Leader and Speaker of the House had I not been on the Public Works Committee, which is where Speaker Rayburn, put him. And again, in addition to being that strong Democrat that he was, I can tell you that bipartisanship was something that he was very fond of because he talked a lot after his career in Congress about how bipartisanship helped make this country strong and about how it helped make him a better member of Congress. And if you go and look in the archives of the Star-Telegram from just a couple of months ago after he passed, you'll notice the remarks that were given from a very bipartisan group of people in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Roger Williams, also from Fort Worth, he was quoted in the Star-Telegram. Kay Granger, former mayor of Fort Worth, also quoted in the Star-Telegram about how Speaker Wright did so many great things for Fort Worth. One of the areas that he liked to talk about was the Voting Rights Act and how important voting rights were to him, and also Eisenhower and the freeways. He told us a great story about how Eisenhower, he and a few other congressmen went to Eisenhower about getting the interstate highway bill passed, and how President Eisenhower said, let's get the votes, let's get it done, and how they came together in a bipartisan way in order to get that legislation done. But my favorite story that he told me about the importance of bipartisanship, and I asked him, I said, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to be a new member of Congress, and so many people talk about how Congress is broken and they don't work together. And I said, do you have any theories on why that is? And he said, that is a very good question. And he said, when I was in Congress, we spent a lot of time getting to know one another. We spent a lot more time in Congress than we do today. And he said, I want to tell you a story. He said, one time I told my daughter, I said, I want you to go get a job. And this was before he was Majority Leader. I want you to go and get a job, and I do not want you to use my name. Whatever you do not use my name. And she came home that evening and she said, Daddy, I found a job. And he was like, oh, great. Where did you find a job? And she said, I got a job in the minority leader's office. And Speaker Wright, the great storyteller that he was, he said, I just exploded. And I said, what? You got a job at the minority leader's office? Did you tell them who I was? And she said, Dad, you told me not to use your name. And he said that he immediately picked up the phone. He calls Gerald Ford up, and he said, Gerald, I need to apologize to you. I want you to know that my daughter has accepted a job in your office, and she is to report to your office first thing in the morning and apologize and say that she cannot accept the job. And he said that Gerald Ford said to him, Jim, if your daughter wants to work here, it won't be any problem at all. And he said, Mark, could you imagine that happening today? And it really stopped and gave me pause just about how much things have really, really changed. Speaker Wright was an amazing person, a person of great wisdom, intelligence, humility. He would talk about how he lost the Senate race and about how it was fine for him to lose that special election for the U.S. Senate because things ended up working out for him in the U.S. House of Representatives. And so he could actually find humor even in something that was, a big defeat for him. And I just wanted to thank him. And I'm so thankful that our paths crossed and that he was such an influence to me and so many others. I can tell you that the city that I'm from, Fort Worth, Texas, that the city is the great city that it is today because of the work and the statesmanship of Jim Wright. And his legacy continues to live on through so many others that continue to serve in Congress today, that are in other positions in office and in business. And Mr. Speaker, I am just very, very grateful and very blessed that I knew Speaker James Claude Jim Wright. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.